It's almost 9:02. Yes.
Okay.
So let's start it. So it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. James Kaihatu. He was my PhD advisor and professor and head of environmental water resource and coastal engineering division in Zachry Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering at Texas A&M College Station. He received his BS from California State Polytechnic University in 1986, and he got the master from UC Berkeley in 1987, and his PhD from U of Delaware in 1994, all in civil engineering. He worked both the U.S. Army Waterway Experiment Station in Vicksburg, Mississippi, and U.S. Naval Research Laboratory in Stennis Space Center, Mississippi, before moving to Texas A&M in 2006. He has worked in the area of nearshore nonlinear ocean wave dynamics and modeling, and wave and mud interaction, tsunami propagation, hurricane surge, inundation, and flood modeling, and post-hurricane structural damage surveys. And he is also former chief editor and present associate editor of the Journal of Waterway, Port, Coastal, and Ocean Engineering. His work has been supported by NSF, ONR, and National Academies, and Qatar National Research Fund, and Texas General Land Office. So please welcome Dr. Kaihatu today. So when you're ready, you can start.
All right, thank you, Wan Yun. I appreciate being invited, and thanks for having me. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. Okay, so I assume you can all see it. I'm going to go ahead and put it in slide mode. Okay, so before we get started, what I do want to mention is that the work that I'm going to present is fairly broad in terms of in the sense that we're using a single model or a set of models for different applications. So we have 4 different projects that we'll be talking about, all of which use the model, but for different ends. And so they have different applications that they use our model results for. So it's good, rather than a deep dive into any one of these projects, it's going to be fairly broad across all these projects, and we'll just talk about where we've been able to make contributions via the modeling. So there's a pretty big list of folks that I've listed here, and some of these include folks that are working with let me engage my laser pointer here. I'm working with at the Environmental Defense Fund. Also, there's some folks at the Geochemical Environmental Research Group here at A&M, or otherwise called GERG. And also some contributions from my former PhD student who's now at Old Dominion, and also there's one faculty member on this list who's at the University of Houston. So I'll go ahead and get started talking about what we're, just going into the presentation. So just a brief thing about coastal surge and flooding. The 2 sites that we're looking at, one's in Houston, which is a sort of a common place, popular place to do a lot of this work, and the Atchafalaya Basin. And for reasons that I'll describe later, I'm having to be a little bit vague about exactly where in the Atchafalaya Basin. I'll talk about the model, and I'll talk about the 4 different projects and how we are able to contribute to it. One's through an A&M Superfund Center, one is through the National Academies, one's funded through EPA, and one's funded through the National Science Foundation, and we'll talk about what remains. So generally, we typically think of 2 different modes of flooding, of hurricane damage, that an impact of a hurricane event on a specific location. Generally, in terms of hurricane surge, what you see here on the right is results from the aftermath of Hurricane Dorian hitting the Bahamas. One of the other things I do besides modeling is I've done a few damage surveys after big events like Dorian and like Hurricane Michael and Hurricane Ian. We look and take a look at, try to get high water levels and look at structural damage. So this video here on the right is something I got from the homeowner. This was in Freeport. He took a picture, he took a video of the second floor of his home being impacted by Hurricane Dorian actively. So you can see the waves hitting the window on the outside of his home. So there's hurricane surge, but there's also flooding, upland flooding, as we see from events such as Hurricane Harvey, where it was primarily rainfall. The surge itself was fairly mild, I think, at least in Houston. And it might have been a different story in Corpus and Port Aransas, but in Houston it was fairly mild, but it was mostly the rainfall that impacted. And so you can see sort of the impact of the floods from Harvey in a particular area. So the point is that we have two different modes of flooding and two different modes of impact from a hurricane event, and being able to do both of these is really what the crux of the matter. So the two sites that we're looking at is Houston, the center of the petrochemical industry, as we know. It's also very susceptible to surge and upland flooding. And there's also a lot of vulnerable communities that border the ship channel. These are areas that they're fairly close to large petrochemical facilities, but are residential neighborhoods. So the impact of an event that does have sort of an environmental subtext to it can really impact these communities very adversely. The other one is the Atchafalaya Basin in Louisiana. It's vulnerable to hurricane surge. It's also vulnerable to riverine flooding. And then it's also susceptible to the effects of sea level rise. Now, our specific goal in that location is to work with a community there through the NSF Coastlines and People program, work with a community there who's concerned about their cultural sites being in danger of being lost due to the impacts of flooding and the exacerbation of those effects by climate change. So I'll just dive right into the model. We're using Del 3D. I know that you all have had some experience with Del 3D. We're using both the flow versions and the flexible mesh versions of Del 3D. We'll talk about why we're still using flow, but it was developed by Deltaris in the Netherlands. When I worked, as one you mentioned, I worked for the Naval Research Lab. When I worked there, we were like the first port of entry for the Del 3D flow model into the US as an open source model. So we use it. It's actually part of the Navy cadre of models that get run for specific applications for forecasts for naval applications. So the flow model is essentially a structured grid model. Uses hydrostatic sigma coordinate in the vertical. You can input wind, tide, wave, circulation, forcing, and so on. The reason why we're still using flow in the light of Del 3D flexible mesh is the fact that it still has the particle tracking available. What we're doing for contamination, we're looking at a few of these projects are looking at transport of contaminants, and we're not modeling the contaminants as in the dilution and the chemical reactions per se at the moment. What we are doing though is we're tagging potentially contaminated water masses using this particle tracking algorithm, and then just seeing how far they go. So we may not know what the concentration might be further down the road, but we know where it's gone. So we're using that as a proxy for contamination. So that's presently only in the flow model. It's going to be, I guess they're working on putting it in the flexible mesh, but that hasn't happened. It's also the model also propagates waves. It uses a phase average formulation, so it propagates energy rather than free surface elevation. And then there's also a sediment and morphological component as well. Flexible mesh is also something that we've been using. It's a combination of structured and unstructured grids. You can delineate waterways and rivers using the structured curvilinear coordinate system. And then for other areas, you can just use an unstructured grid. So in that case, it does a very good job of delineating waterways, which is something that's kind of not present in the flow model, the structured grid flow model. So, but at the moment, it does not have particle tracking. So we are having to kind of straddle both. So the first project that I'll talk about, and this is what got me sort of into these new applications of the model, is via Texas A&M Superfund Center that was funded beginning in 2017 by the National Institutes of Environmental Health Sciences, NIEHS. Now, the center is a 10-year center, and we were involved with the modeling. Our modeling served them for the first 5. So we're not presently part of the center at the moment. It's part of the edict that after 5 years you do a big radical shift in direction, and so we didn't make the cut, if you will, for the second half of that. But this is what the center administration and layout looks like at the for the first 5 years. We have several projects that look at what happens if, so the scenario here is what happens if there's a big hurricane like Ike, but this time much bigger, much more devastating surge in the Houston area, sediments that are potentially contaminated sediments, perhaps unrealized Superfund sites on the floor of Galveston Bay. I know all of a sudden carried on land with the surge and then, put into these vulnerable neighborhoods. So Project 1, which is the one I had worked on, is essentially providing information about these hazards. And then the other projects are involved with mitigation, both on an emergency level and also in the long-term nature-based incorporation of nature-based solutions mitigation aspect. So our primary goal is doing the modeling here is to, there's some here in the chat. Okay. Okay, I'm sorry. Everyone sees the slides, right? Okay. All right. So,
Yes.
okay, great. Thanks. So anyway, so what we're doing, what we had done with the work here is to do this the surge and the sediment transport, and be able to model the on-land deposition of sediment that was previously on the floor of Galveston Bay onto these areas, onto the land areas, carried forward by the surge and then left there. Now that's an application that really hasn't been done before. So what we wanted to do first is see whether or not, just have a big signal and see whether or not we can do that with this model. So our initial attempt was to sort of approximate Hurricane Laura. This is a little bit into the project. We have been working on other things up until this point, but at this point we decided we really need to get serious about the sediment modeling. So Hurricane Laura was coming to town, and we weren't sure where it was heading. So someone at GERG had gotten in their truck and driven down to Houston and installed these sediment samplers, about which I don't know anything. So I'm not sure what I can say about those, but they were at areas where previous simulations by the Del3D model had shown were susceptible to high degrees of surge. So, and were also accessible by the road, because a lot of the areas right by the ship channel you can't get to. So anyway, what we wanted to do here was simply put in a very big wind in the model from the cardinal directions, north, south, east, and west, and just see what would happen, just see how big of a signal you would need in order for sediment to become suspended and be transported by the surge, and then be left behind as the surge went away. So that's what we did here. So these are purely hypothetical situations here. You see the winds coming from the north and the south on the upper and lower panel here. This is just a oscillating water level, not oscillating, but the surge caused by winds from these two directions, and from the east and the west also. Now, one thing that you notice from the east and the west is that from the west, there isn't a lot of surge that gets carried onto the eastern shoreline of the upper portion of Galveston Bay and Buffalo Bayou. However, in the eastern side, when winds are blowing from the east, there's quite a bit of surge, which you can see right here. So this area is known as Mud Lake and Clear Lake, and it's about where I think is where NASA is. So there's a lot of surge that ends up getting piled into this location, and hopefully with that we also see some sediment deposition. So this next plot shows it's basically the result of on-land deposition from the model. I should mention that we're modeling a combination of sand and mud. We have a small sand layer on top of a mud layer at the bottom, and the exact parameters of which I don't quite recall, but it is sand over mud. And then we deposit everything onto land. From the west, okay, so I should mention what these colors represent. Anywhere where there's red, there's deposition, maybe less to about 5 centimeters, blue to 10 centimeters, and so on. The cyan is probably the deepest at 0.5 meter, which is really kind of unrealistic, but these are hypothetical situations anyway. So from the west, you see some deposition way up here in the northern part of this domain. This heads toward the San Jacinto River. You see a little bit of that up in the ship channel. Some happen to be in these locations where they're the triangles, which are the locations where the sediment samplers were installed, and some on the along the Mud Lake and Clear Lake regions. However, from the east, it's a lot more exacerbated, very deep deposition over in Mud Lake and Clear Lake, and maybe lesser deposition along the ship channel. These are more red, whereas over here, they're more like a blue and cyan. So lower levels of deposition. So we're clearly able to then put sediment on land and have the surge recede and have the sediment remain on land. So that's encouraging. So we did this with Hurricane Ike and something I'll call Super Ike. We use if you're familiar with the HWind database, this is a database for that melds the drops on data from the Hurricane Center along with various model results to kind of come up with a wind field that mirrors the variability of hurricane winds. So it's something. It's not quite HURDAT data, but so we use that and essentially doubled the wind speeds in that field in order to come up with Super Ike. So Super Ike is basically 2 times Ike. So on the right, you see, on the left, you see what happens under Ike. You see some small amounts of deposition on Mud Lake, Clear Lake, and some of these areas as well. Up over here, this always tends to be pretty high. I should also mention here that the colors mean different things now. So red is a centimeter at max, and cyan is now no longer 0.5 meter, but 10 centimeters. So yeah. So what you see here, though, is that up over here, there's a lot of deposition. And I think what's going on there is that that's the upper edge of the domain, and we don't have an open boundary condition there. So numerically, things are getting piled up. So I would take these readings with a grain of salt. But we do see some deposition on land in these areas. And if I were to do Super Ike, it actually is quite a bit more deposition in this lower area right here. This is an area where there is high degrees of surge. So, the bottom line here is that the deposition seems to follow the surge levels, and we are able to deposit sediment on land. This was then used, these results, the one on the right and the left for Ike, were then used as a way to help figure out where to put in sample points for sediment sampling, to take a look at. This is for take a look at sort of the background levels of potential sediment contamination in these areas. The gold circles here and the red circles and the blue circles indicate sediment sampling locations. And so the black is really where the model has predicted sediment should go. So it seems like, we are able to show, okay, we are able to show where are good places to go sampling. And this ended up in a publication a couple of years ago in International Journal of Environmental Research and Public Health. And so this is like one example of how we take our models results and have that used for a different purpose. in order to to meet the goals of the project. We also looked at the ITC fire. If you're not familiar with the ITC fire, it was a fire that occurred right around here where the arrow is. This is where Buffalo Bayou kind of turns into the ship channel. They're going east to west. There was a big fire there in St. Patrick's Day of 2019. The firefighting foam that was used had PFAS in it. And so there was some interest in trying to figure out where that water went, right? So we use these drogues to try to figure out the numerical drogues and try to figure out where things would go. Essentially just releasing them at the location of the ITC fire every so often, and then tracking where the water would go. Now, early on, there was some thought that maybe it wouldn't go anywhere, but it is tidal, even though this is a very shallow area that's kind of remote from the Gulf and from Galveston Bay. It is tidally driven. So there is water that moves around. As you can see, this wide area is basically the amassed path of all these drogues moving back and forth. So we expanded that a little bit by modeling for a month and a half after, both before and after the event, and then putting in a drogue, releasing one once a day at midnight at the location of the ITC fire. So what this shows on the left is these orange circles are the locations of water samples that were done by the group, and these blue dots are individual drogues and how they sort of like where they've gone, essentially. So the entirety of their past, not just a snapshot, but the entirety of all the motion of all the drogues that we put in. On the left is what happens if you only include the tidal motion, but on the right is what happens when you also throw on the winds. And you see the winds have a pretty strong effect on where sort of the dispersion of these drogues. So really carries things a lot further away from the ITC, and also seems to match pretty well where the sample points were taken, which do indicate some degree of contamination. So that was fortuitous. And so that ended up in another publication that, again, just using our hydrodynamic results to help inform other inquiries. And this came out in 2020 in environmental pollution. Okay, so now that work kind of led to other work. And so now we are the hydrodynamic folks for a project that's funded by the National Academies through the Environmental Defense Fund. We are subaward to the EDF. And here, rather than simply looking at areas right by the ship channel, we're kind of looking at all of Houston and trying to understand the instances of toxic releases potentially due to flooding and how that could be exacerbated due to sea level rise in the Galveston Bay area and in general Houston. On top of that, we also want to explore what we call nature-based solutions to help mitigate some of these potential vulnerabilities, and essentially using master plans drawn up by landscape architects here at A&M to then use a model to evaluate their efficacy. So that's what we're doing in this particular project as well. So here, this is the entirety of the Houston watershed, as shown in this sort of this gray line here, and sort of the petrochemical facilities within the area that we're studying. So there's quite a few. And the thing is that, I mentioned this, we don't have a convenient catalog of what's where, what kind of chemicals are in what facilities. That is slowly being amassed, but it is not straightforward by any means. So again, we're using our drogues to kind of be used as a proxy for the transport of contamination and flooding events. So with that in mind, I'm sorry, let me talk about the overall project aim. So there are, again, we're a small part of a fairly large project, and these activities include things like taking recreationally caught fish and just inspecting the tissue, trying to get an idea what the baseline level of contamination might be, prioritizing and characterizing petrochemical facilities, what they have, sort of a history of releases in the past, toxic accidents or releases in the past. And that's where the computational modeling comes in, just doing hydrodynamic surge and flood modeling, and then trying to see where all this stuff might go, and then exploring nature-based solutions as well. So we are in that particular box right there, providing information to both ecosystem health and then also using that to evaluate mitigation efforts with these nature-based solutions. Now, at the end of all this, everything goes into something known as ToxPy. ToxPy is a visualization tool that can provide a numerical score for vulnerability ranking. So, it takes a lot of things into account. Flooding is not all of it. It takes things like, say, annual income for an area. It takes instances of, where you are at percentile of childhood cancers, leukemia and lymphoma, respiratory issues, these sorts of things. So it's basically a very large of it is demographic. And then you map on top of that the vulnerability to flooding and by a combination of surge and or rainfall. So, and then that also mixed with the proximity to petrochemical, to some kind of facility that has a history of having toxic releases. So that ends up being the final target of everything that we're doing. So since we are doing inland flooding as well as just a surge, we use the Del 3D model primarily to do the surge, and then the flow from rainfall, from upland flooding, from riverine sources comes through the soil and water assessment tool, or SWAT. And what this does, this is a very different model. You define these reaches and waterways ahead of time, and then you define subbasins within which rainfall runoff would flow into that reach of the waterway and then get carried down. So you have to define the waterways in advance and the subbasins in advance. So it's able to also do sediment transport as well as pollutant load, if you know what it is. And so for each subbasin, we end up with a cumulative flow rate and then a yield added on top of that for each subbasin. So that gets input as daily average flow rates into the Del 3D model, so we can combine it with any hurricane surge that might occur. Now, in this area, since we're using Del 3D flow, again, for the reasons I've mentioned, this is the finest nest that we're doing. It's a bunch of telescoping nests all the way from the Gulf of Mexico to these areas right here, run at somewhere between 80 and 30 to 80 meter resolution. And I'll talk about why we have to use 30. It's best to use 30 meters here in a little bit. But these are the 6 areas that we're focusing on. All of these have a fairly high degree of industrial density. So being as we're coupling models now between SWAT and Del 3D, how do we do it? Well, optimally, you would just put in SWAT at the boundary of the Del 3D domain and just have it flow down what you consider to be the waterway and then back out through the outflow boundary. It's not quite that straightforward because the boundaries in Del 3D are a little sensitive. So basically the way we do this is we have, we put in the SWAT input as a discharge, which is something that we can do in Del 3D. Simply add it in as a discharge, added mass into the system, it's able to handle that. And then since we don't predefine the waterways in Del 3D, which is something I really need to emphasize, the anticipation is that the discharge will flow down the waterway that it finds in the topography that it's given inside the model and then out. So that's our workaround at the moment. So we'll start off with Hurricane Ike. Hurricane Ike is sort of our convenient exemplar of storms for the area. So I'll show a validation exercise in a little bit, but here what I want to do is just show the impact of just what we do with the drogue, these numerical these numerical tracers. So in this location, what I've done is I've put 6 of these drogues at the beginning of the simulation for Ike, and then run them with discharge from the SWAT model and without. So this is a starting location. Now, if you don't have the discharge, this is the paths of some of these drogues. They all tend to be up inland because of the surge. There's no other contravening flow to push things out to the Gulf. So all you see is things moving to the north and upland down these waterways. And then there are a few areas that are down over here and another one down here that are not touched at all. Now, if you do add the discharge on top of the surge, then you see a very different picture. You actually do see things moving out into the Gulf. And actually, this one starts moving around even though the surge didn't touch it. So it's really the discharge that's causing that particular particle to move around. So there's some importance there for adding the discharge. So then what do we do with all this? Well, one thing that we do is we query the results from Del3D, look for things like maximum water level, residence time, and other things that we consider to be important characteristics of flooding events. And then we put that into QGIS and come up with a geotiff image. So that gives us all the necessary metadata, and that can go straight into ToxPy. So that's really convenient. All I have to do is give them a geotiff image, and I'm good to go. So in addition to event-driven things like Ike, we're also interested in longer time series. We use a couple here. One is 2015, which for Houston, oops, my dog is snoring. 2015 was a fairly wet spring for Houston, and 2017, I think we all know what happened then. So we're just using these 2 year-long simulations here to run through our modeling system. So in this one, it basically shows post-Harvey, the water depth and some drogue tracks. Okay, so this is centered on Galena Park. Galena Park is right here. Here's the Houston Ship Channel as I'm tracing it with the laser pointer. And these are waterways that were found, I guess, by the discharge going through the lowest parts of the topography that was given to Del3D. Again, we don't define this in advance. And this is really where using Del3D flexible mesh would have an advantage, because you can define those in advance using a different gridding system through them. But here we don't do that. And so we see some waterways here, and we hope that they match some things that have been observed. We also put some drogues out, and just generally what we see over the course of Harvey is that some of these drogues just started on land and then ended up going into the ship channel, going downhill essentially. There are also some that didn't move at all, just kind of hung around. So, but these are the drogue travel paths that we came up with. So, because we don't have the waterways defined, one thing that we need to do is make sure that the waterways that the model does trace out match what we can see. And so one way to do that, just using Google Earth as a 0th order validation, can we do the waterways that are traced by the model, and are they reflected in the Google Earth? And we do see that here. So essentially what this is, as traced out by the model, is Bray's Bayou, which we can see here in the Google Earth image, and then down over here, this area, this Sims Bayou, also seen in the Google Earth image here. So basically what this says is that the topography is resolved well enough to lead to these resulting water courses that are then reflected in Google Earth and observed. So now during Harvey, one thing that happened too is that there seemed to be what we thought was maybe a breach of some kind, some overflow right in this location. We weren't quite sure what it was, and then we took a closer look at Google Earth, and it turns out that's tracing out this thing called Kuhlman Gully. It's an area, when just looking at it in more detail, it's an area that's usually dry, but when there is a big flooding event, it does. I guess it's there's a waterway that does get full. So it seems as if though that waterway got full during Harvey. Now, one thing that we still need to do is validate this flow path and these flooding depictions from Harvey, because the using data, because the overarching perception is that Harvey was basically all of Houston was underwater. A lot of areas were very much underwater, but I don't know how widespread that was. So we're looking at some data right now from, I guess, Colorado State, try to get an idea of where the flooding impacts were in this area for Harvey, and whether or not this seemed to match those observations. Okay. So why do we? So this is where we're talking about sort of the trade-off that you have in using Del3D Flow, a structured grid model in doing flooding. So on the left is what happens if you use a 80 meter resolution. Clearly, we're not getting anything that's remotely resembling anything that you might see, in terms of the waterways. It's just kind of spilling all over the place. It's really kind of a mess. It's 1 year simulation, and the discharge. This simulation took 2 days to do. Now on the right is what happens if you tighten the resolution to 30 meters. Here you have 1 year's worth of data, a simulation, and you do see the waterways as reflected in Google Earth. That seemed very evident, but it took like 6 days. So you kind of have to pick your poison, I guess. So anyway, so I know that there's the obvious solution to this would be to just go on like a HPC or a high performance computing system. And we've done that for the model. We've not found, because of the fact that the wave model is there, it's not parallelized as well. We haven't found a great deal of benefit, I guess, maybe in terms of turnaround time, maybe in terms of just putting something in a queue and setting it and forgetting it. There's some value to that, but we've basically just been using PCs for this. I have several now PCs in my office that are grinding away. So now that also led that work in conjunction with the NAS work. We've also been doing some work with the EPA, looking specifically at Galena Park. And here we are using Del3D flexible mesh because we don't have a need to do any drogue simulations here. Here we're looking at flooding, and we're looking at the vulnerability of this area to flooding, and working directly outreach with the community there. So this is a depiction of flood risk from other factors, from using other means other than the Del3D model to get an idea of what areas might be ripe for a buyout, for inside Galena Park. So with that, we again using Ike as an exemplar, and we're using Del3D flexible mesh here. The upper two figures on the upper left show grid resolution in terms of I think it's one measure of the triangle. I forget which one, but basically the more red, the higher the resolution. And so you see fairly coarse resolution in the Gulf. And then as you get into the Houston Ship Channel, here is more red. And this area right around Galena Park is more widespread because we're trying to also encapsulate these creeks as well. The Panther Creek, Hunting Bayou, Vince Bayou, Sims Bayou, Brays Bayou as well. So we want to capture those in the model. Now this shows that we're just simply using unstructured grids. Later on, later in the project, we actually went through and replaced the unstructured grids in the waterways with curvilinear grids. So we were able to better define what the waterways are. But we put in these discharge points in the model as well. So using all that, we did some validation for Ike against measurements of water level. And we do a pretty good job. The water level, the model is in the orange, and the observations are in the blue. And you can see in some instances, we're not able to get to the maximum before the gauge just kind of gave up. But for those instances that we were able to get the entire peak, we do pretty well. So, and the one that is kind of important to us is Manchester, because this is closest to Galena Park, is well within the Houston Ship Channel. So one thing that we wanted to do in order to evaluate vulnerability as well is to take a look at what happens if you shift Hurricane Ike a little bit. Hurricane Ike, it wasn't clear that it was the impact on Galena Park was the worst it could have possibly have been. So we shifted the landfall location of Hurricane Ike in 3 locations, 50 kilometers to the southwest, 100 kilometers to the southwest, and 200 kilometers to the southwest. 50 and 100 tends to put the strongest winds in Ike over Galveston Bay. And so that would lead to the maximum amount of surge. What we were trying to figure out is whether a remote, shallow, narrow area like the Houston Ship Channel would be vulnerable to shifts in the hurricane track. And it turns out it is. So all these plots here show comparisons of Hurricane Ike in the blue versus the shifted Hurricane Ike surge levels. 50 kilometers with the, let's see, where's it? In the orange, 100 kilometers in the yellow, and purple is 200 kilometers. So what you see definitely is that you see a higher degree of surge, and particularly in Manchester, right there near Galena Park. So clearly there's a very strong component of surge that survives having to get funneled up the Buffalo Bayou and west into the ship channel. Now, what I'll say here too is that the 50 and 100 kilometer locations are not, they're not completely arbitrary. Basically, what we did is we looked at the it turns out that the 50 and 100 kilometer locations are well within the model track guidance error of Hurricane Ike during the forecast period. So 2 models provided forecasts at those locations, and those were folded into the guidance during Hurricane Ike. So this is well within the guidance, model guidance error. So it's not completely unrealistic. And so this just shows, what's the cycles again, shows the difference in the surge levels. On the left is what could have happened during Hurricane Ike. You don't have any data to back this up in this specific area, other than just the water level data, but this shows at Kinder Dock 4 in Galena Park, maximum surge level about 48 inches from Ike. That's on the left. And on the right is what happened if you were to shift the Hurricane Ike 50 kilometers to the southwest. So what was once 48 inches of maximum surge turns into 118 inches of maximum surge. So these sorts of parameter changes and resultant effects on Galena Park we wrote up for a paper that we submitted to Coastal Engineering Journal. We got the review comments back, and we revised it to be submitted. So hopefully it'll get accepted this time. And we also looked at nature-based features and the impact on flooding. So essentially looking at incorporating green infrastructure into the area, areas of enhanced drainage, maybe berms and levees and things like that. So this was a master plan drawn up by Galen Newman in our landscape architecture department at A&M, looking at very specific locations where you can put in green space and have some drainage underneath and drain the water away, and then seeing what the impact is. What our modeling would show what the impact is on that green infrastructure as a mitigating device. So what we did here is the result of that. We used all 3D flexible mesh to show what would happen if we incorporated these measures. Now, we were a little bit primitive in doing that. We basically just put in sync points in these areas where we felt that these would enhance the location of these green infrastructure points were. So on the top left is what happens if you don't. This is a aerial extent of maximums of aerial extent of flooding at the peak surge for Ike. This would be what would happen if you had no mitigation in place, and then if you did have the mitigation in place, you see a greatly reduced aerial extent, right? So that's one impact. Another impact is on retention time. Retention time. How long the stuff stays around. So on the top figure here, these are just time series of inundation at various locations inside the area. What you see is a strong increase and then a low, long decrease as the floodwaters tend to hang around some more. You see that retention time greatly reduced with the impact of these, with the incorporation of this green space. Now, I'm not saying that this is going to get built, but this does show what the potential benefits of this master plan are. And so then again, this is another example of where we're using our modeling to answer a problem that we haven't really considered as modelers in the past. So this has been now published finally in the Frontiers Landscape Architecture. So final project I'll be talking about deals with surge and flooding damage potential in the Atchafalaya Basin. And so this is Hurricane Laura. She's coming into the National Hurricane Center graphic for that. So as I mentioned, as I mentioned before, where I'm not going to be discussing exactly where we are doing the modeling, just kind of sort of in general, the Atchafalaya Basin area. Excuse me, though, one of the reasons for that is that the project that we're working on, this is through NSF, Coastlines and People program. Our interaction with the community that we're working with there is sort of covered under our IRB, Institutional Review Board. And so there are certain things that we can't necessarily reveal at this point without passing that to the community. So I'm just going to be a little bit vague in terms of exactly where we are, but in general in this area. Okay. So one of the things that they're interested in is the impact of sea level rise and potential for structural and erosional damage for their culturally significant sites. And this just shows what the impact of elevation might be in terms of what can befall you or befall them during a particular event. This is from Hurricane Michael for our damage survey here. On the left is a house that seemed to have emerged unscathed from the floodwaters of Michael. On the right is one that is definitely scathed, I guess is the opposite of unscathed, and very clearly heavily damaged. So just for reference, the front of the house was right here and was then pushed backward a distance of roughly 20 feet or so by the floodwaters. Now, the thing about surge is that surge is not really a damage agent per se. I don't want to be, in terms of structural damage, it's sort of a chaos agent in that it carries the waves, which actually do the destruction, to the structure. So in this case, what you see are these very strong damage. This high level of damage is caused by waves being carried by the surge and impacting the structure. Whereas on the building on the left, which has is 1.2 meters at the first floor higher than the one on the right, seem to have survived that. So that's about where the surge level was. And if you then factor, so that gives you an idea of how sensitive the level of damage is to the water level and the surge levels. And if you then add sea level rise on top of that, then you could have a potentially different picture. So what may have survived a hurricane now may not survive the same strength hurricane, same other characteristics, but with an additional sea level rise on top of that. So we are then doing our usual thing where we bring the hazard. This is Galveston, but the principle is the same. We bring the hazard to the location of interest and then provide the hydrodynamic context to it. So we're doing this in two regards, two aspects. One's just using Del3D flexible mesh. In this case, we're using Hurricane Laura. This is a water level map of Hurricane Laura as it's traversing the Gulf, and you can see the elements here in of Del3D flexible mesh grid. And then we're also, because we're also interacting with structures and also with erosional foundations, foundational erosion rather, we have to do things in a more impulsive time domain type of view. So it isn't enough to simply say the waves are this high over some time period, the way you would be able to do if you were happy with that coming from a model like Del3D and SWAN, which is the wave model inside Del3D. Here we actually have to take that and then divide it up into time series. and then feed that time series into the FUNWAVE model. So the FUNWAVE model is a time domain phase resolving model. It's often called the Boussinesq model because that refers to the mathematical formulation behind it. But the difference is that with SWAN, you just have a measure of energy. You don't see the actual bouncing of the free surface the way you would if you were at the beach. You just see energy coming in. And so what we have to do is then take that and take the spectrum, which is the active variable being modeled by SWAN, and then divide it up into amplitudes, and then take those amplitudes and then use random phases to come up with a free surface elevation, which we show right here. And that would then be used to force the FUNWAVE model. And then that would then use the braking mechanism in the FUNWAVE model to impact the structure or the the foundation. So what we're doing here as well is that we could, it's debatable, I guess, whether or not we actually need to do another set of models, maybe something like open foam or something where we'd actually take this output and do some highly detailed modeling around the structure. Now, fortunately, the other components on this team are actually using highly detailed models to do that. So, oops. Okay, so here we're modeling a surge in this area, just using the FUNWAVE model. You can see sort of the mist is sort of what looks like a very happy mist of it's actually surge water flooding into the area. So we're able to do this with with a FUNWAVE now, and now we're going to be coupling that with the Del3D model. So what's left is the incorporation of future scenarios, looking at incorporating HEJM data to then for the winds, and then downscaling it to then take a look at future scenarios under these in these projects, and also filling out the hurricane database using synthetic hurricanes as well. TCWISE is a synthetic hurricane database that is tuned for Del3D. So we'll be using that to kind of fill in the gaps between historic hurricanes in order to help sort of better nail down the vulnerability and the risk. So that's where we are at the moment. A lot of tendrils, but again, we are taking our model results and then feeding them to other folks who are doing more involved stuff and different type of work. So that's where we are at the moment, and that's everything I've got. So if there's any questions, I'd be happy to field them.
Okay, thank you very much, sir. We quickly open a Q&A session. Any question to Dr. Kaihatu?
Here's a chat.
Yeah.
Hi, is SWAT and Del3D coupled one way? How does SWAT handle floodplain inundation, or is that handled inside Del3D? How easy it to test out the design impact of this and different? Okay, I see. So the question has to do with how SWAT and Del3D are coupled. So first of all, yes, they are coupled one way. SWAT is basically incorporating the SWAT output is being used as discharge inside the Del3D domain. So I think let me see if I can get to that slide just really quick here. Yeah, right here. So right, so what you see here is that we're not the waterway that comes from SWAT is not directly input into Del3D. Basically, just the output, the resulting discharge down that waterway is incorporated as an incoming discharge. So it's basically adding mass into the system. The floodplain inundation, I think it's treated as just runoff. I'm not sure exactly how it treats the floodplain inundation. There's it does have a overflow capability, but Yeah, there's also, so it does overflow its banks. I don't know how far it goes, so maybe throughout the entire subbasin. And then there also is runoff that goes into the river back from subbasin yield due to rainfall back into the waterway. So in that sense, it's you could have an overflow, and you could have input into the waterway from rain. Inside Del 3D, it's basically you can put in precipitation into Del 3D. We didn't do that here because we basically kind of assumed that everything is kind of built inside the SWAT discharge, so that would handle both the riverine flooding and sort of any runoff that occurred upstream. So I mean, that's something we can do, but we didn't do that here. In terms of how easy it is to test out and design different NBS, right now, the way we're doing it, as I mentioned, is simply as adding sink points, just locations where there's going to be a net loss of mass inside Del 3. So in that sense, it's really easy. If you have like an open area that's intended to be an area of increased discharge, you just put in a sink point and you can make mass go away. Now, you can do that by just taking a look, using some kind of infiltration formula to do that. If you want to do something like add berms or something, that's a little bit more involved. Then you'd have to go and take the topography within the model and adjust that. I hope that helped.
Okay. Is there any other question?
I have a quick question if nobody else does.
Sure.
Oh, well, Susan Havorka had a question. Address hers by all means.
Okay. Particle tracking, which is where it's mobilization of path contamination, stored in base sediments, are released from. Oh, yeah, that's a good question. I really don't know the answer to that one. My guess is that probably the release from industrial facilities might be worse. I guess because there's always going to be some degree of flooding, and it may not necessarily be surge. So the surge may not reach, like during Harvey, the surge may not reach a power and energy level where it can do a lot of sediment redistribution and so on. So that may be a little bit more hit and miss, but I would think that if something were on the ground or actively leaking inside a facility that was then getting carried by floodwater, that would probably end up being worse. Now, having said that, in terms of maybe potential, at least that would be chronic at the time. In terms of maybe if there were inundation and enough deposition on land, that stuff hangs around, and it may not be. So okay, I'm trying to figure out a good way to say this. I think in terms of the immediately, it would probably be the release from facilities. In terms of maybe if a deposition event were to occur, that's probably more sporadic and maybe more hit and miss in terms of where there might be the greater amount of a higher degree of damage. But I think that in that case, it might be more difficult. I think I kind of split the middle on that particular answer. But I think right at the point of the flood, more common it would be the floodwater transport of contaminants. So.
Okay, we can take one more question, Justin.
I mean, mine's kind of a general question. So, so I actually grew up in Deer Park, Pasadena. So I was just curious, you were talking about, right, contaminants stored in the bay sediments. And, I know from experience that, they dredge the channel periodically. Yeah. And I was just wondering if that's accounted for in any way in your sort of parameterization of contaminants stored in the sediments and sort of the overburden or anything like that.
That's a good question. No, not at the moment, not. I think because a lot of what we're doing with the sediment right now, I'm doing stuff like depositing sediment on land with the presumption that it could be contaminated, right? There are a lot of Superfund sites in the Galveston Bay that are basically capped sediments that have so far have held. So is not clear, and I think the Corps of Engineers they get involved pretty early in any sort of dredging to do this sort of environmental testing of sediment. So I think we don't have that incorporated in the model at the moment. Let's put it that way, because I don't know, we know where the Superfund sites are, but we don't know what is to be a future Superfund site, I guess, right? So if this is a way to discover that would be bad, but I'm not, we don't have that incorporated. We're basically saying, this is the potential, because once stuff gets on land, then we say it may be contaminated, but might not be contaminated. But if it is, then you might want to check it out. But it's there on land right now. I don't know if that helps.
Yeah, for sure. That's just my immediate thought. I'm not an expert in this area, but I thought, could that have an impact if they just dredged, and if they dredged, did it, does it stir things up, or where do they deposit the dredge material? And I just thought, that's sort of an interesting angle on it.
Yeah, it could. I mean, I think stuff that is recently dredged and deposited is more mobile, but it hasn't had a chance to consolidate.
Right.
Definitely with mud, for sure. Because if you have, two storms that hit in sort of succession, you actually see less mud-related wave dampening in the second storm that's come by, because the mud hasn't consolidated enough in order to serve as a dampening agent for the waves. So if you have two successive storms, then the waves are a big factor in the second storm, more so than it would be if there had been more of a time period between the two storms and the mud had been allowed to consolidate, and then we're better able to dampen the wave. So yeah, clearly there's an impact there to the consolidation.
Thank you.
Okay, it's almost done. Thank you very much today, talk and your time.
Sure.
So I have a set of questions, but we can communicate via email.
Okay.
Okay.
Fine.
Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Appreciate it. Bye-bye.